Hello, and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change Podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behaviour. My name is Jamie West. I'm a writer, musician, and performer, and I'm joined by Professor Emeritus of UCL fame, Robert West. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm very similar to what I was about half an hour ago.
Very similar. Well, that's good. That's stable. So this is the second part of our double episode feature about experts. And I did promise something in the last episode, which, I don't like to do. I don't like to promise anybody anything, but I did. And what I'd like to talk about today is how we spot the signs of an expert, someone we should trust, and signs of someone that we maybe shouldn't trust, and the degree to which we might trust or not trust that person. So I thought we'd start with what are the signs of somebody who's a sort of a dubious quote unquote expert? What sort of behavior do they exhibit?
Yes, a dubious expert who may still be an expert, but they could have all the qualifications. So the way that we often ascribe expertise is we look at people's qualifications, don't we? We say, do they have doctor before their name, or professor, or they're a qualified lawyer, and so on. And we often rely on that. Of course we do, because that's how it goes. And there are even protected professions that legally you can't call yourself unless you have a certain qualification, and that's aimed to protect people against bogus things. But even within that, of course, there'll be people who express views that are outside their area of expertise, or where they are biased in a way that means that they're giving you bad advice. And so the question then, as you say, becomes, how do you spot that? And there's a number of warning signs, and one of them is over certainty. They state things with a degree of certainty that just isn't warranted by the level of evidence that exists. And obviously, if you're not aware of the level of evidence that exists, that you wouldn't be as someone who's relying on an expert, then that's going to be tricky. So all you've got to go on in that case is their level of certainty. And by and large, in a lot of the things that people, so-called experts, proclaim about and are actually wrong or giving you bad advice, they're areas where you cannot be certain. You can have a degree of confidence, but you cannot be absolutely certain. So if someone says to you, this is perfectly safe, and you think, really? Are you absolutely sure? Then you would say, okay, this is not necessarily someone whose views I'm going to take seriously. But if
of course they might mean, just to jump in, when someone says it's perfectly safe, they may not mean it as literally 100%. They might just mean it sort of idiomatically in a kind of a way. You go, it's perfectly safe to go and do that. They don't mean, you don't take that literally.
I suppose that's true. If the context will give you a clue there. But but sometimes people will say that. They'll say in a way that is not idiomatic, or that this is terribly harmful. I use the case of smoking and e-cigarettes and so on quite a bit in examples, because it's quite a sort of rich area for examples of decision making and beliefs and so on. You will have people who are supposedly experts, public health experts, who will say with utter confidence, even organizations that will say with utter confidence that e-cigarettes are as harmful or more harmful than cigarettes, than conventional cigarettes. Now, that statement is almost certainly false, because of everything we know about what the constituents of e-cigarettes are, everything we know about the way that the body responds and so on. I couldn't say with 100% confidence that they're wrong. and I wouldn't. What I would say is that is almost certainly wrong. And that's what you're looking for in those kind of situations, to say someone, I can't be 100% certain, but, the evidence to me looks as though, that belief is wrong or that belief is right. So the 100% certainty in a domain where it's unlikely that that's going to be realistic, I think is a good signal.
So what we're talking about here is nuance and the degree to which someone is open to expressing nuance and also revealing uncertainty, revealing that they don't necessarily know everything and that they're giving you their best estimate and they'll often say, they might say, look, I'm sort of 90% sure, I'm 95% sure, if the evidence supports that kind of claim.
Yeah, that's true. And often also it's it's better if they can say why they're 99% sure. So if you say, when I say, look, I'm 99% sure that e-cigarettes are much, much, much less harmful than conventional cigarettes or tobacco cigarettes. And the reason is that the concentrations of chemicals, known toxins and so on, is much, much lower, or those chemicals aren't there at all. And that we now have quite a lot of data extending over a fairly long period of time, where if we were seeing the kinds of harms that people are suggesting, if they were there, we would start to see them. So they say, what a good expert who deserves to be treated as credible would say, I'm X% sure, and this is the reason.
And I suppose they may be able to give references to say, there's a study, I'm basing my opinion on this study or this meta-analysis of the data. And then someone can independently check that if they're inclined to do so. They're not sort of cagey about where their sources have come from. And also that those sources themselves are trustworthy, reasonably trustworthy, not 100%, because nothing could be. But you kind of go, okay, that's in this respected journal. It's likely to be. And oftentimes it's not just a single study, is it? Because single studies are not that revealing.
Well, often not. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, particularly in areas that we're interested in, health, environmental sustainability, complex real world problems, because single studies only ever take place in a single context, and context effects can be important usually with a single population or a single sample. So, even when you see a really strong result from a particular study, you should always say, well, that's interesting. That sets up potentially a very strong hypothesis. But, we're looking for confirmation or disconfirmation from other areas.
I've noticed that a lot of disinformation that comes my way, and I do not seek it out, I will say, kind of has a narrative to it, a familiar narrative. And the narrative goes something like, in the most clickbaity way, this is something they don't want you to know. This is something no one talks about, but actually this is true. And that is a fascinating sort of, it kind of gets round your defenses a little bit if you're sort of not switched on in some ways, because it's such a compelling narrative, isn't it? You kind of go, oh, I know something now, and I do generally kind of mistrust some of these people who are, I do mistrust politicians anyway, and that chimes with that.
Yeah,
or I mistrust some scientists or something.
Yeah, that's true. What's interesting there is, of course, now it has become so ubiquitous in terms of getting you to click on things that I mean, as soon as I read that in the headline, I don't go onto that website or that YouTube.
But I've had people say that, people who I'm talking to in person use this formulation to me, and then I go home and I'll be like, that was interesting. Let me check to see if I can corroborate their claim often can't.
So I think that you're right that a lot of the dodgy information that gets put about is put about capturing this thing that we talked about in the last episode about trust, and about they're capturing this sense, which is greater in some people than others, of not trusting authority, not trusting the establishment, not trusting government, not trusting pharmaceutical companies, not trusting scientists. That's the they, and they don't want you to know this, and you are now on the inside track because you've heard this, bit of information. So that is one of the ways in which people can help to get past your defenses. I think another way is by putting in sort of spurious details into what they're saying. 97.4% of people, believe X or do X, and that actually taps into a tendency that we have to find more credible things that have specific detail in them, because as when we're making a judgment about credibility, we're thinking, well, they wouldn't, if it weren't true, how would they be able to give that level of detail? But of course, you could just make it up.
I think there's something sometimes about the manner in which someone approaches a topic. What I'm thinking about is somebody who kind of does ad hominem attacks on their opponents. Somebody who kind of discredits, and this kind of speaks to what we were just talking about with going, oh, they don't want you to know this. But it can be sort of more specific than that, which is that, oh, actually the NHS are doing this, or it might be a specific scientist or something like that, where they kind of do ad hominem attacks as opposed to addressing the argument itself and addressing the evidence itself.
Yeah, and like the spurious detail, it captures something that has a nugget within it of potential value, which is you should pay attention to the source of the information. You should say, if this person has a history of lying, then you should doubt what they say the next time they say something. The problem, of course, with that is that when people use these ad hominem attacks, they say, well, they've got a conflict of interest, classically in sort of a lot of the sort of medicine and science and public health area. This person's got a conflict of interest. Is that then what they're doing is they're trying to get you to discount something that someone said purely on the basis that this person has some attribute that would make them less trustworthy, potentially. And so we get this kind of interesting situation in public health where if you have and this has been said about me, I mean, if you have a conflict of interest because you've done consultancy for a pharmaceutical company, for example, nothing you say is trustworthy and can be believed. And obviously that is taking this sort of nugget, because someone should take account of a conflict of interest, particularly when it relates to that particular topic. But there are other factors as well. And so I guess with these ad hominem arguments, they are taking something that is, a nugget that, you should be taking some consideration of, which is the nature of the source, but you shouldn't use that as your sole criterion for whether you judge something to be true or not.
But you also put your conflict of interest page on your website. It's not a hidden thing. It's not something that's going to appear as a surprise in private eye or something like that. And it's not as if you're secretly trying to get people to buy more of a product and your research is then being influenced by that.
No, I mean, conflicts of interest are very interesting because the way that they're treated in medicine and public health is primarily around financial conflicts of interest, and where so if I've done consultancy for and received payment from a pharmaceutical company, which I have, then there is a reasonable presumption that I might, not necessarily that I would, but that I might be influenced by that. But what we've had great difficulty with are the conflicts of interest that are probably at least as profound, which arise from one's belief systems and the kind of affiliations that one's got. And of course, it's very tricky to say how you should handle those. My view is that everything should be declared. It should all be out there. So if I'm someone who has a particular value judgment about the topic, like nicotine is bad for you, or tobacco is bad for you, and I'm starting with, well, obviously tobacco is bad for you, but let's say that it's the devil's work. That's going to influence the way that I interpret my data, what data I use, and so on. Very hard, though, to sort of get a handle on how you should get that declared, I think.
So I want to move on now to when we're looking at an expert who is helpful and is someone that we should pay attention to. What counts as evidence? That's what I want to talk about. What sort of things are evidence? Because there are lots of things that are not evidence that appear to be evidence, things like anecdotes and straw polls. And, when news organizations go out into the street and they just put a microphone in someone's face and say, well, what do you think about this? And that's somehow they get one person who thinks yes and one person who thinks no. And, it's always really, it's fun. It is entertaining, but it's obviously a nonsense.
Well, it is
not a total nonsense, but it's not evidence anyway.
It's not evidence, and I would say it's worse than total nonsense because, and it's very invidious actually, because what they'll do is they'll say this is only a straw poll. You see this in sort of question time type shows. This is just a straw. But let's hands up in the audience who believes X, and the fact that they've said, this is only a straw poll, not to be taken seriously, it's like, okay, then why are you doing it? What value does it have? And the reality, of course, I think, is that people do pay attention to it, and so you've got this weird situation where people, you've managed to discount or sort of inoculate people against the disbelief by preceding what you're doing with that sort of statement. Now, and I have to say, we said in the last episode, we played this little game about what percentage of things that do people believe that are just wrong. I think a lot of what people believe that is wrong comes from anecdotes, straw polls, and that kind of thing, and hearsay. I mean, hearsay is
they're compelling. That's why they're very compelling, because they have a theatrical power, they have an immediate power, they have a personal power. Hearsay or something that's I heard this, so it kind of. There are rumors that I was told growing up, or that I'm still like, God, was that true? Like, it has, even from, like aged 9 or something, you're like, oh, there is a special power that rumors and hearsay and things have.
I think they the power. I think the power that they have is partly because they have narrative. They're a story. Partly because they have an interest value. It's because they have either a surprise component or a sort of contrary component to them. You would think this, but actually this, or they actually tap into something you really want to believe. Yeah, well, I knew it. I knew that they were like that or whatever.
So let's talk about what is good evidence. What should we be relying on?
Right. I think there's a number of features that you're looking for. One is what kind of data are being used to support the statement? Are the data objectively collected, numbers from some device that collects data in an objective way? In science, you have microscopes or laboratory experiments with detectors of one sort or another. In our own lives, it might be official figures that have been collected in a particular way, and with a particular methodology. So the nature of the data is one thing. The way that the data are collected in terms of, for example, the sample. I mean, a lot of the time, the things that we're taught about or people talk about, people say this, people do this. And then you look at it, well, what was the sample exactly? How big was the sample? What was the question that was asked? So you want to know if it's a survey, for example, or people's beliefs about things, what exactly was the question that was asked? What were the response options? What was the sampling technique, and so on? These are all the kinds of things that we pay attention to in behavioral science when we're trying to judge prevalence of various things. There's the interpretation of the data. One of the things that is very interesting when you look at economic data is that they overinterpret tiny differences. Oh, it's gone up by 0.5%, or down by 0.5%. Yes, that's quite well within the margin of error of your sampling technique or your measurement, and so on. So be looking very much for the kind of it's boring for lay people to talk about, but it's incredibly important for anyone working in behavioral science to think about the statistics underpinning it. What are the likelihoods that there is a genuine difference there based on, I'm a big fan of Bayesian statistics, but other statistical methods can also be used. So you've got what kind of data is it? What's the methodology that's used to collect the data? What kind of statistics or analysis is being undertaken? And then how is that all being put together in terms of the interpretation in the context of what's gone before? So one of the problems we have in behavioral science, as in lots of areas, is that we have these discrete studies. You do a study and it finds X, and then but a previous study didn't. Maybe it didn't find it, or it found it to a lesser degree, or it found something different. Essentially, what we're really looking to do is to use evidence cumulatively to build on what's gone before. So, if there's 20 studies that have been done that found that nicotine replacement therapy aided smoking cessation, and then a new study comes out that finds that it didn't, you're not going to go, oh, it doesn't. What you're going to do is incorporate that into the previous studies and say, what's the picture here? What's the overall picture? And that's often done quantitatively with meta-analyses and so on. But a lot of the time, as just users of this kind of data, we have to do it, qualitatively in our heads. But always be trying to look at all of the evidence, not just this bit of evidence or that bit of evidence.
And I suppose for lay people like me, I'm going to be reliant to a large extent on experts who are looking through this data and then providing advice. And that's where what we talked about earlier comes into play, where you look at the ways in which the expert is talking, their credentials, who they are, and any kind of all these red flags which we discussed, which are definitely stuff to not ignore. It doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong, but it's where a healthy skepticism comes into play.
Yeah, and a classic example of that is where someone has done a study which shows X, and all the previous studies have shown Y or not shown it, but the press release is about that study, the headline is about that study, and that expert is punting that study. We talked about competing interest, conflict of interest. They have, without question, a conflict of interest because they want to get publicity for that study, because that kind of thing affects reputation and careers and grant funding and so on. So so often when you read a newspaper article or a headline about a study, what you will often find is the expert reporting on that study is taking that study and not considering it in the context of all the other research that's gone before. And that's something to always be on the lookout for when you see a study and it's got some shocking finding. Be thinking to yourself as you're listening to the expert, but that's one study. What about all the studies that have gone before?
Great. Well, I hope that's something that listeners can take and kind of arm themselves with this information and this little bits of advice and tips
from an expert
that you've given from a real life expert.
Given with utmost confidence, by the way, Jim.
I'm perfectly certain. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. Do have a look in the links below where you can buy our books, which are lots of fun. And for now, it just remains for me to say thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Jamie.
And thank you for listening wherever you are. And we look forward to joining you next time on the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast.